The Dark Scrolls. Under the dim glow of time's unrelenting passage, one tale still lingers like the echo of a prayer whispered beneath cathedral stone. The union of Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York. Their story is both a crown and a wound, sealed in the wax of history, yet still trembling with human breath. It begins not in love, but in blood, the kind that soaked England's soil for over 3 decades during the War of the Roses. The chronicles of that age speak of banners torn by wind and ambition, of brothers turning swords against each other beneath the same sky. From those ashes rose a man whose very existence seemed fragile, improbable, and yet destined. Henry Tudor, the last hope of a dying house. Across the chaos, in the corridors of another fallen dynasty, a girl was growing into womanhood, Elizabeth of York, daughter of the vanquished, born to wear a crown yet cursed to see her father's legacy crumble. England was a fractured realm when Henry was still a fugitive. Suspicion ruled more than law, and every oath was poisoned by fear. The nobility wore loyalty like a mask, changing colors with the tide of power. Henry spent his youth as an exile, shifting between the uncertain kindness of foreign courts. He learned the quiet patience of survival, the art of waiting until fortune bent her will. His blood carried the claim of Lancaster, but that claim was as thin as parchment left too long in the damp. He had no army, no riches, and yet, in the minds of those weary of endless war, his name became a prayer. Elizabeth's world was gilded yet trembling. Her father, King Edward IV, had restored some measure of peace, but the peace of that court was never clean. Betrayals came not from enemies, but from within. Alliances formed and broke like glass under pressure. When Edward died, his sons, the young princes, were taken to the Tower by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. What followed remains one of England's darkest silences. The boys vanished. No witness, no grave, only whispers. And Richard emerged crowned as King Richard III. To many, Elizabeth became the rightful heiress, dispossessed, a living emblem of York's lost glory, and to some, a symbol dangerous enough to be used. Henry, meanwhile, watched the storm from across the Channel. He had fled to Brittany, then to France, bearing the weight of prophecy and desperation. Those around him spoke of divine justice, that he was fated to restore balance to the realm. But prophecy in that age was a fragile kind of armor. Henry knew he would need more than destiny to claim England. He needed legitimacy, something stronger than bloodlines drawn by clerics and argued over by lords. He needed York. And in Elizabeth, the last rose of that house, he found not only a key to the throne, but, perhaps, an unspoken kind of redemption. The battle that decided his fate was brief yet seismic. On the field of Bosworth in 1485, banners of red and white clashed beneath the grey morning mist. Richard III, mounted and defiant, charged with the ferocity of a man who believed in his divine right to rule. Yet destiny, often cruel, turned her face away. As Richard fell, struck down in the mud, the crown was found among the broken armor. They say it was placed upon Henry's head by Sir William Stanley, a coronation born not in a cathedral, but on the battlefield itself. That moment, the chroniclers tell us, was both an ending and a beginning. For the first time in decades, England had one king unchallenged. But the crown Henry wore was heavy with ghosts. He was a conqueror, yet his legitimacy was fragile as glass. Every noble eye watched him for weakness. Every whisper reminded him that his bloodline was foreign, his claim uncertain. To secure the peace he had won, Henry needed to turn victory into unity. He needed to end the hatred between red and white. It was then that his thoughts turned fully to Elizabeth. The idea of their union was not born from affection, but from necessity. Still, in the quiet corners of recorded memory, one senses that Henry saw more in her than a political bond. She was the daughter of the man his cause had long condemned. Yet her grace, her calm, and her quiet endurance seemed to speak of something England had forgotten: gentleness after ruin. In the winter following his coronation, Henry entered London as king. The city watched him with cautious reverence, uncertain if peace would finally hold. He moved with the restraint of a man who had known exile too long to celebrate victory. His coronation preceded the marriage, a deliberate act to show that he owed his crown not to Elizabeth's claim, but to his own merit. Only after his rule was sanctified by the Church did he reach out to the woman who could heal his kingdom. The marriage between Henry and Elizabeth in January 1486 was, in every official sense, an act of state. But contemporary accounts speak of something more intimate, beneath the ceremony's solemn grandeur. The great hall of Westminster shone with gold and candlelight, yet it was the symbolism, not the splendor, that mattered. Red and white roses intertwined in wreaths, banners bearing the emblems of both houses hung side by side. In their union, the chroniclers declared, the war had ended. Yet those who lived near the royal couple would later write that something deeper grew in the quiet years that followed. Henry, a man tempered by fear and calculation, found in Elizabeth's presence a stillness he had never known. She was not a woman of loud passions or courtly intrigue. She ruled by kindness and example. While Henry secured his dynasty through law and vigilance, she rebuilt the idea of monarchy through humanity. In those early days of their reign, England began to breathe again. The scars of war were still visible. Fields left fallow, fortresses half in ruin, but the people spoke of hope as if testing a word they had forgotten how to use. Henry strengthened the crown, rebuilt the treasury, and dismantled the private armies of lords who had once torn the nation apart. Yet the real stability, unseen in statutes and decrees, lay in the image of their marriage. A king and queen whose partnership seemed to mirror the harmony they sought to restore in their realm. Letters from the court, sparse but telling, reveal a domestic warmth rare among monarchs of the time. They dined together often, prayed together, shared their griefs in private. Henry, cautious and secretive in statecraft, was said to be unguarded in her company. Elizabeth's chambers were described as bright with laughter, the sound of children, the smell of rosewater and parchment. Theirs was not the theatrical romance of poets, but the enduring affection of two people who had learned to trust after years of betrayal. Still, the shadow of politics never fully lifted. Pretenders arose, claiming to be the lost princes from the Tower, testing the strength of Tudor rule. Henry's paranoia deepened, and some say Elizabeth's heart broke a little each time he turned suspicion toward those once loyal to her father's house. Yet she stood beside him, never openly defiant, never submissive, only constant. It is said that in moments of solitude, Henry would look upon the royal seal bearing the Tudor rose and murmur that its beauty was hers, the red of his passion and the white of her purity bound together forever. Whether this is truth or myth, no historian can say. But it remains one of those details history refuses to discard, perhaps because it feels too human to deny. And so, as the 15th century waned, England entered a fragile peace. The wars were over, but their ghosts lingered in the walls of every hall, in the faces of every noble who had once chosen sides. Yet above that quiet unease stood two figures who, by accident or divine design, had turned enmity into love, and love into the foundation of a dynasty. The records of their early reign read like an effort to restore not only a kingdom, but the soul of a people. Henry rebuilt trust in law, curbing the violence of lords who had feasted on war. Elizabeth restored the idea of grace within power. She became a queen who soothed rather than ruled, who brought gentleness where there had been cruelty. In her, the people saw not the daughter of York, but the mother of England's future. The scholars of later centuries would argue endlessly over the sincerity of their affection, whether it was convenience dressed in poetry or true devotion forged in necessity. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere between. What cannot be denied is that in the silent language of history, the gestures, the letters, the mourning, Henry and Elizabeth stand apart from the usual theatre of royal alliances. Theirs was not born in innocence, but in the weary wisdom of survival. And from that union, the House of Tudor rose not merely as a political construct, but as a living emblem of reconciliation. Every chronicle that mentions them seems to pause for a breath of tenderness, a rare softness in the annals of kings. It was as if England itself, exhausted by decades of fratricide, needed their quiet affection to believe again in mercy. Thus begins the chronicle of their love, a tale where duty became devotion, and where two souls born under rival banners learned to speak the same language of peace. And though centuries have passed, the echo of their vows still lingers like candlelight flickering against the cold stone of Westminster, reminding the world that even within the architecture of power, love can take root, fragile yet immortal. Beneath the stone vaults of Westminster, where the murmurs of coronations still haunted the air, the union of Henry and Elizabeth began its quiet reign. England, exhausted from civil strife, watched them with the wary hope one reserves for a truce after too much blood has been spilled. The court chroniclers wrote of solemn vows and golden processions, yet behind those official words lingered something more intimate. Two strangers bound by duty, learning slowly to become something more than symbols. The early months of their marriage unfolded in the chill of English winter. The fires in the royal chambers burned constantly, not for warmth alone, but to remind the palace that life persisted. Henry, so long a wanderer, was a man uneasy with stillness. Even as king, he walked as if expecting betrayal to spring from every shadow. Elizabeth, by contrast, moved through that cold season with a grace that disarmed even her husband's caution. She was no politician, no schemer. Those who served her wrote that she preferred the company of her ladies and her children's nurses to the endless games of intrigue that defined court life. Yet her presence was a form of quiet power. She softened the edges of the new dynasty, transforming what had begun as conquest into something that resembled peace. Henry had known exile and battlefields, but he had not known gentleness. The first letters that survive from his reign speak of order and taxation. But between their lines one can sense a man learning how to rule without the sword. He often retreated to the Queen's chambers, where Elizabeth read to him from devotional texts or spoke of her father's reign. Those rare moments when her voice bridged the chasm between two houses once sworn to destroy each other. In the stillness of those evenings, amid the glow of candles reflected in tapestries woven with roses, the seeds of affection took root. When their first son, Arthur, was born in September 1486, the kingdom rejoiced as if heaven itself had confirmed the union. Trumpets sounded through London, and every bell in the city rang to announce that the line of Lancaster and York had merged into new life. Elizabeth endured the pain of childbirth in silence, surrounded by midwives and clerics murmuring prayers. Henry, who had faced armies without trembling, was seen pacing outside the chamber, pale and restless. When the infant's cry finally pierced the air, witnesses claimed that the king, usually so restrained, closed his eyes and whispered thanks to God with a sincerity that startled his attendants. From that moment, the royal household began to resemble something unseen in generations. A family. The palace gardens filled again with laughter. Courtiers spoke of a gentler mood that spread from the Queen's quarters outward, like warmth radiating from a hearth. Elizabeth adored her children with a quiet devotion, yet she never lost the calm dignity expected of a queen. She supervised their tutors, ensured their prayers, and embroidered garments with her own hands. Henry, for all his austerity, was tender toward her in private. Servants recounted that he often brought her small gifts: a carved ivory comb, a sprig of hawthorn from the royal gardens, a piece of foreign silk from merchants newly welcomed to England's ports. Yet the peace they nurtured within their walls was fragile. Outside, the specter of rebellion never vanished. In 1487, only a year after Arthur's birth, a boy was crowned in Ireland under the name Edward VI, claiming to be one of Elizabeth's lost brothers, one of the vanished princes of the Tower. Whether he was truly of royal blood or merely a pawn mattered little. The danger was real. Henry's armies crushed the rebellion at Stoke, but victory brought him little joy. He returned to London more suspicious than ever, his gaze sharpened by the realization that even the memory of York could still raise armies against him. Elizabeth understood that fear better than anyone. Her loyalty to her husband never wavered, but she bore the guilt of being York's daughter, a reminder to many of what had been lost. Whispers followed her through the corridors, some calling her a saint, others a silent usurper's wife. Yet she endured it all with composure. Those close to her later wrote that she never defended herself with words. Her defense was her conduct, the serenity with which she performed her duties, the tenderness with which she tended her family, the patience with which she bore her husband's long silences. Henry, who trusted few, came to rely upon her entirely. He consulted her in matters of the household, then in the upbringing of their heirs, and finally, though he would never admit it publicly, in the tone of mercy he showed his enemies. Once, when a captured rebel was sentenced to death, Elizabeth interceded quietly on the man's behalf. "We have had enough of blood," she is said to have whispered. The man was spared. The king said nothing then, but that evening he placed his hand upon hers during supper, a gesture unnoticed by most, yet remembered by the few who did. Their affection deepened, not through grand declarations, but through endurance. Each year brought both joy and grief. Children were born. Some lived, others did not. The Queen's health waned with each confinement, yet she never complained. Henry's letters, though terse, began to include lines of personal concern. "May God preserve the Queen. For her welfare is the surety of mine," he once wrote to a minister, words that revealed more of his heart than he perhaps intended. As their reign settled into rhythm, the court became a reflection of their dual nature. Order and compassion bound together. Henry's reforms filled the royal treasury and curbed the feudal chaos of previous decades. Elizabeth's influence, subtle yet constant, humanized those measures. She insisted that charity remain part of royal duty. Alms were distributed to widows, hospitals endowed, and scholars supported. The people, weary of tyrants, began to believe that perhaps this new dynasty was touched by something resembling grace. But the ghosts of the past were never fully laid to rest. Pretenders continued to rise, like shadows testing the strength of the new sun. The most dangerous of them, a youth named Perkin Warbeck, appeared in the 1490s, claiming again to be the younger prince, Richard of York. His cause found sympathy abroad, even in the courts of Burgundy and Scotland. Henry's paranoia hardened. His network of spies expanded. In those years, the Queen's face was often described as sorrowful, as if each rumor of another lost brother reopened the wound she had carried since childhood. Still, she never wavered in public. She stood beside her husband at ceremonies, calm and radiant, the living proof that York had not been destroyed, but transformed. Historians have long debated whether Henry truly loved Elizabeth, or whether she remained only the vessel of his ambition. The surviving fragments of their life together suggest something more complex, a love that began as necessity, but matured into devotion. Theirs was not a romance of passion, but of endurance. Not a flame that consumed, but a steady fire that survived storms. Henry, wary and pragmatic, may not have spoken of love often, but his grief after her death would later expose the depth of it beyond doubt. For now, in those middle years of their reign, the royal couple embodied the fragile peace of their kingdom. They travelled often, to Winchester, to Woodstock, to the great halls of the north, bringing with them the image of stability England had long craved. Wherever they went, the people lined the roads to see them. Some knelt, not for the king, but for the Queen, whose smile was said to carry the memory of her father's house and the promise of a gentler future. In private, their life was modest by royal standards. Henry disliked extravagance, seeing it as a provocation to envy. Their chambers were furnished simply, carved oak, tapestries depicting saints and seasons, a few precious relics from older reigns. The Queen's favorite was said to be a small painting of the Virgin and Child, which she kept near her bed. Servants noted how often she prayed before it, her lips moving silently as the candles flickered. Perhaps she prayed for her children, or for peace, or for the forgiveness of sins she had never committed. By the mid-1490s, their family had grown. Arthur, the heir, was followed by Margaret, Henry, and Mary, children whose futures would shape the next century. The sound of their laughter filled the corridors, softening the stern rhythm of royal life. Henry, though often preoccupied with state matters, was a watchful father. He ensured that his children's education matched his vision of kingship, disciplined, devout, and practical. Yet Elizabeth added warmth where he imposed order. The children adored her. Even foreign ambassadors wrote of her maternal sweetness and the harmony of her household, a rarity in courts accustomed to suspicion. Amid this domestic stability, England prospered. Trade flourished, the coinage stabilized, and the Tudor rose became a recognized symbol of unity. Yet every gain carried a shadow. The king's vigilance never relaxed. He taxed heavily, saved obsessively, and trusted few. Some said his eyes had grown colder with each year of rule. Only in Elizabeth's presence did that frost seem to thaw. When she entered a room, witnesses described the change. The king's shoulders eased, his expression softened, as though the air itself had lightened. Their marriage, while not without strain, was a partnership of equals in endurance. They shared not only triumphs, but also the slow ache of losses, of children buried too young, of friends executed for treason, of a nation that seemed forever on the verge of unrest. Through it all, Elizabeth's presence was constant, her faith unbroken. Those who served her believed she understood the loneliness that haunted her husband, and perhaps loved him all the more for it. The chronicles of that age rarely speak of love directly. It was not a word kings were expected to use. Yet in every gesture, in every act of shared devotion, their affection is preserved like pressed petals between the pages of history. Theirs was a union that turned politics into poetry, a love story written not in declarations, but in endurance, forged in the crucible of necessity and crowned by trust. And so, in the quiet years before tragedy would return, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York stood as the living symbol of a nation reborn. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster, amid the flicker of candlelight and the rustle of silks, two hearts, once divided by the banners of war, now beat in unison. And though neither could know how brief their peace would be, for a time England itself seemed to breathe again, as if soothed by the gentle rhythm of their shared love. The years that followed were quiet on the surface, yet beneath that calm flowed the silent currents of love, duty, and fear that defined the reign of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. The court had grown accustomed to their rhythm, the measured pace of a king whose trust was hard won, and a queen whose grace mended what politics could not. But history, ever restless, does not allow peace to linger for long. By the close of the 15th century, England had begun to look different. The scars of civil war faded under new prosperity. Ports revived, new merchants rose, and roads once choked by soldiers were filled again with carts of trade. Yet, in the corridors of Westminster, the same cold wind of caution lingered. Henry ruled as though the war might return at any moment. His nights were long. He kept ledgers by candlelight, balancing not only accounts but also alliances. Those who saw him at his desk spoke of a man haunted by the price of the crown he wore. Elizabeth, in contrast, became the living counterweight to his vigilance. She moved softly through the palace, her presence like a prayer against the hardness of kingship. Her beauty was no longer the youthful radiance sung by poets, but a serenity that time could not diminish. Courtiers often remarked that she seemed most radiant when among her children, Arthur the heir, Margaret bright and willful, young Henry sharp and ambitious, and Mary gentle as her mother. Together they formed the image of a dynasty reborn, a family that seemed to redeem the decades of bloodshed that had preceded them. Life in the royal household was not untouched by sorrow. Several of their infants had died in the cradle, and each loss deepened the quiet understanding between husband and wife. Henry, who rarely wept in public, was seen once leaving the Queen's chamber with reddened eyes. Elizabeth bore her grief in silence, praying before the small image of the Virgin that always hung near her bed. The servants said that after each loss, the king spent more evenings in her company, not speaking much, but content simply to sit beside her, the candlelight flickering across the gold threads of her gown. It was in those domestic hours that their love found its truest form. They were not lovers of passion and spectacle, but of constancy. two weary souls who found peace only in one another. Henry's affection was expressed through protection. He ensured her comfort, her dowry lands, her status as queen, beyond question. Elizabeth's love was expressed through patience. She endured his absences, his secret counsels, his suspicion of nearly everyone else in the realm. When ambassadors spoke with her, they noted that she defended the king gently, almost tenderly, as if aware that behind his authority lay a man forever chased by shadows. The turn of the century brought both triumph and omen. In 1501, the long-awaited marriage of their eldest son, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon was celebrated with all the splendor the Tudors could muster. The union promised alliance with Spain, then the most powerful realm in Europe, and confirmed England's return to the stage of great nations. Elizabeth, resplendent in cloth of gold, watched her son take his vows with pride, tinged by melancholy. For all her royal bearing, she remained a mother watching her child step into a world as perilous as the one she had inherited. Arthur and Catherine were sent to Ludlow Castle, far from the court, to begin their married life. The winter that followed was bitter, and by spring, news arrived that would shatter the calm Henry and Elizabeth had built. Arthur had fallen ill, the sweating sickness, some said, and within days, he was dead. The chronicles record the reaction in formal phrases. The king and queen received the tidings with great heaviness, but eyewitnesses described something deeper. Henry locked himself in his chamber, refusing counsel. When Elizabeth was brought to him, she knelt beside him and said, "We must thank God that we still have a fair prince and fair children." Only after comforting her husband did she return to her own rooms, and there, alone, she broke down, her sobs carrying through the stone halls like the lament of England itself. Arthur's death altered everything. Henry's hope for the future, so carefully constructed, faltered. The weight of expectation shifted to their second son, the young Prince Henry, not yet 11. Elizabeth devoted herself to the boy's upbringing, ensuring that his education combined strength with compassion, though few could foresee the restless, imperious man he would become. In those grief-laden years, the king and queen seemed closer than ever. They dined privately, walked in the gardens, even in winter, and spoke often of simpler days, of exile, of the first months of marriage, when all had been uncertain, yet strangely pure. Henry, once a man of calculation, began to show flashes of sentiment. He ordered new portraits of Elizabeth, not as queen, but as wife. Her hair unbound, her gaze turned slightly toward the light. He had them hung not in public chambers, but in the private gallery near his study, where only he would see them. Still, the demands of rule pressed upon him. The rebellion of Cornwall in 1497 had left scars. His tax collectors were feared across the land. Elizabeth saw the growing discontent and pleaded for mercy where she could. Once, when a delegation of townspeople came to Westminster seeking relief, Henry dismissed them curtly. That evening, Elizabeth spoke with him quietly at supper. The next morning, the tax was reduced. When his advisers protested, the king replied only, "The Queen has spoken my conscience." But even love could not still the tide of mortality. Early in 1503, Elizabeth again became pregnant. She was nearing 40, her body worn by years of childbirth. Henry worried, though he seldom voiced it. On February 11th, at the royal residence of the Tower, she gave birth to a daughter. But the child lived only moments. Fever followed swiftly, and within days Elizabeth herself began to fade. The chronicles tell the rest with chilling brevity. And there the Queen departed this life, to the great sorrow of all England. Yet beneath that line lies a silence that history cannot fill. Witnesses spoke of the king's devastation, how he refused food, how he shut himself away for days, emerging pale and hollow-eyed. He ordered her chambers sealed, her belongings untouched. The court, usually a place of ceremony and calculation, fell into mourning so profound that even the servants moved in whispers. When at last Henry appeared in public, his face was altered, the austerity of rule giving way to something rawer, grief stripped of dignity. He wore black for months, then years, never again the bright colors of state. His council urged him to remarry. Foreign envoys brought offers of alliances through new queens. He turned them all away. Those who visited him in later years spoke of a king surrounded by shadows, his treasury full, his kingdom stable, but his heart sealed within the memory of a woman who had made his reign human. He kept near him a few tokens of her life: the rosary she had once carried, the small book of prayers she had written in her own hand, the ring he had given her before their wedding. It is said that he touched these objects each morning, as though drawing breath from them. In the silence of his later reign, he rebuilt the Lady Chapel at Westminster, intending it as the burial place for his dynasty. There, beneath its carved fan vaults, he planned that he and Elizabeth would rest together. The work began during his lifetime and consumed much of his fortune, yet he oversaw every detail: the marble effigies, the angels that would hold their crowns, the inscriptions that spoke not of conquest, but of unity. Some say the chapel was his final act of love, a cathedral carved from grief. Meanwhile, their surviving children carried forward the legacy of both parents. Margaret married into Scotland, uniting two kingdoms. Mary would one day wed a king of France, and the young Prince Henry, fierce and brilliant, prepared to inherit a throne forged in both blood and tenderness. He would become Henry VIII, a monarch remembered for passion and ruin, a man shaped, perhaps unknowingly, by the quiet love that had given him life. The later records of Henry VII describe a ruler withdrawn yet resolute. He tightened the crown's power, ensured his son's succession, and continued to collect the revenues that would make the Tudors among the richest of European houses. But behind those acts of governance lay a man still haunted by absence. When he walked the gardens where he had once strolled with Elizabeth, he was seen pausing often, as if listening for her voice. In his final years, illness and melancholy overtook him. On cold evenings he would sit beside the fire, gazing into the flames for hours. One chronicler wrote, "The king was much given to remembrance." Perhaps he remembered the scent of her hair, the sound of her laughter, the soft assurance that once anchored his restless heart. When death came in 1509, it was said he met it calmly, holding a small cross of gold, the same she had used in her prayers. His last request was that he be laid beside her. And so, in the Lady Chapel he had built for her memory, they were reunited. Centuries have dulled the marble of their tomb, yet the effigies still lie hand in hand. Visitors sometimes remark upon their expressions, serene, almost alive, as though some echo of their bond lingers in the stone. Around them, the Tudor rose blooms in carved relief, red for Lancaster, white for York, intertwined forever. Their love was born of necessity, tempered by duty and sanctified by loss. In the chronicles it survives as a political union, in the whispers of history as a testament to the rare moment when power and tenderness found common ground. And though their dynasty would blaze and shatter in the generations that followed, the story of Henry and Elizabeth endures. The still point in a century of storms, the promise that even amidst the ruins of ambition, two hearts might find peace. The years that followed Elizabeth's death moved slowly, as if time itself had lost its rhythm. The court of Henry VII became a place of echoes, corridors too wide for the few footsteps that passed through them, chambers still scented faintly with rosewater from the days when a queen had walked their halls. The laughter of children had faded into the memories of tutors and servants, and the king, once vigilant and sharp as a blade, now seemed worn, his eyes hollowed by an absence no crown could fill. He had survived every enemy: exile, betrayal, rebellion, disease. Yet what he could not survive, not entirely, was love. Those who saw him in the months after Elizabeth's passing said the man who emerged from his seclusion was different, thinner, greyer, moving like a ghost through the rituals of kingship. He held audiences, signed decrees, and listened to petitions, but his replies were slow, as though each word had to travel through fog before reaching his lips. The silence of his private life weighed upon the palace. Servants whispered that he still visited her rooms, though they had been sealed since the day of her death. Once, late at night, a guard saw a single candle burning behind the door of the Queen's old chapel, and the shadow of the king kneeling before the altar. By morning the candle was gone, and Henry was back in council, his expression unreadable. The loss of Elizabeth changed not only the man, but the kingdom. The warmth she had brought to court life vanished, replaced by the measured austerity of her widowed husband. The festivities that had once filled Westminster with music and dance became rare. The Queen's musicians were dismissed, her tapestries rolled and stored. Where her voice had once guided acts of mercy, now law alone reigned, cold, efficient, unbending. Yet Henry was not cruel. He was simply emptied. The tenderness that Elizabeth had drawn from him was buried with her. He spent hours at his desk, surrounded by ledgers and treaties, the instruments of governance that had always given him control. But now they were no longer tools of ambition. They were distractions, barriers against grief. His counselors, wary of the king's solitude, urged him to remarry. The dynastic future of the Tudors still depended on strength through alliance. Spain, Burgundy, and France all sent envoys offering brides, widows, princesses, noble ladies of great fortune. Henry entertained the proposals, but never with conviction. He met one ambassador privately, who later recorded that the king's tone was courteous, but hollow. "I have known the company of a virtuous woman," Henry said, "and though the world may counsel otherwise, I am not inclined to tempt fate twice." The only brightness in those darkened years came from his children. He turned his attention to them with an intensity that surprised even his advisers. Prince Henry, now the heir, became the focus of his care, the embodiment of everything that had been lost and everything that might still endure. The king oversaw his education personally, hiring the best tutors, ensuring that the boy learned not only Latin and scripture, but also the arts of music and diplomacy that Elizabeth had once cherished. Yet, even in fatherhood, grief shadowed him. He saw in his son's face the same sharp eyes and golden hair that had belonged to his mother. On certain days, he could not bear to look at the boy too long. One chronicler wrote that his grace would pause in his discourse, his mind wandering, as though he beheld in the prince a ghost rather than a living heir. At the same time, the widowed king began to withdraw from the pageantry of monarchy. His appearances in public grew fewer, his attire darker. The once meticulous ruler, who had rebuilt the image of royal authority after years of anarchy, now seemed indifferent to spectacle. Audiences that had once marveled at his composure now saw instead a quiet sadness behind the mask of dignity. He had become the keeper of his own legend, not its master. It was during this period that he ordered the construction of the Lady Chapel at Westminster, a masterpiece of late Gothic architecture, a vision of heaven carved in stone. Officially, it was to be the dynastic shrine of the Tudors, a place where his descendants would rest. But those who watched him oversee the plans knew its true purpose. It was his last gift to Elizabeth, the monument through which he hoped to speak to her beyond death. He demanded perfection, every vault, every carving, every saint's face rendered with a devotion more like prayer than craftsmanship. He visited the site often, even as his health declined. On cold mornings he stood beneath the rising arches, the air thick with the scent of lime and dust, and spoke with the masons in low tones. When asked about the angels that would adorn the ceiling, he said, "They must look as if they are watching over her." The foreman, puzzled, did not ask whom he meant. He knew. Beyond the chapel, Henry's reign pressed on, though without joy. The years brought a sense of security to England. Trade flourished, the treasury grew, rebellion subsided. Yet his subjects rarely glimpsed the king who had once embodied restoration. The legend of the unifier had faded into that of a solitary ruler haunted by love. Letters from foreign courts began to remark upon his melancholy. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the English king was rich in coin, but poor in mirth, his visage pale and his eyes deep, as one who hath seen all that is to be seen, and found it wanting. Such observations, though distant, captured the truth. Henry Tudor had achieved everything he once dreamed: the crown, the peace, the dynasty. And yet, without Elizabeth, it meant nothing. In private, he remained loyal to her memory, with almost monastic devotion. The Queen's prayer book, bound in crimson velvet, was kept beside his bed. On holy days, he ordered masses to be said for her soul, and personally attended them. The clergy noted his silence during the ceremonies, the way he stared at the altar candles as if waiting for them to flicker into the shape of her face. He wrote rarely now, but one fragment survives in a note to his confessor. "All things under heaven are vanity, but love remembered." Historians have debated the authenticity of those words, yet they fit the man he became, a ruler whose heart remained bound to a single lost presence. Meanwhile, his children matured. Margaret married James IV of Scotland, sealing a fragile peace that would one day unite the two kingdoms. Young Henry grew into a prince of striking confidence, handsome, bold, and adored by the court. He had inherited his mother's charisma, but not her restraint. The elder king watched him with a mixture of pride and apprehension, perhaps sensing how much of Elizabeth's gentleness the boy lacked. Mary, their youngest surviving daughter, stayed close to her father's side, often reading to him from the Queen's old books. She reminded him of Elizabeth more than anyone. Her voice, her kindness, the way she would place her hand upon his arm when he drifted into silence. Some said that in those moments, the old king seemed to live again, but time, ever indifferent, continued its work. By 1508, Henry's health had worsened. Gout, fever, and the slow weakening of the heart plagued him. He moved between his palaces, Richmond, Greenwich, Westminster, each seeming emptier than the last. On quiet nights, attendants heard him whisper prayers not to saints, but to her. "Elizabeth, wait for me." When death came, in April 1509, it was neither sudden nor feared. The king lay upon his bed, the cross of gold clutched in his hand. Those who were present later said that his expression was peaceful. The lines of worry eased at last. His last words were barely audible. "Into thy hands, O Lord," followed, some claimed, by a name, hers. He was carried to Westminster, the same church whose foundations he had strengthened, and laid beside Elizabeth in the Lady Chapel. The ceremony was solemn, without the grandeur of his coronation, but filled with a reverence that transcended pomp. 2 marble effigies were carved in their likeness, the king in armor, the queen serene beside him. Their hands, sculpted as if joined in eternal prayer, rest together still. The chroniclers wrote that, "Thus ended the reign of Henry VII, a prudent prince, full of wisdom and virtue." But beneath that epitaph lies another truth, that his wisdom was born of fear, and his virtue sustained by love. For centuries afterward, the story of Henry and Elizabeth would be told, not as a romance of passion, but as a parable of healing. They had turned civil war into peace, suspicion into trust, politics into affection. Their union became the mythic root of the Tudor rose, a symbol of reconciliation, of 2 halves made whole. Yet there is something more haunting beneath the legend. Their love, though true, was shadowed by loss, the loss of innocence, of children, of peace. Henry's heart, bound forever to the woman who humanized his reign, could never escape the quiet tragedy that defined them both. Today, those who walk through Westminster Abbey sometimes pause before their tomb. The air there feels different, still, almost sacred. Light filters through the stained glass, falling upon their marble faces with a glow that changes with the hours. The inscription beneath them speaks of kingship and virtue, but it is their hands that hold the truth. Stone upon stone, century upon century, their fingers remain entwined. And perhaps that is how history should remember them, not as rulers who built an empire, but as 2 souls who, against all odds, found tenderness amid the machinery of power. Their story began in blood and ended in silence. But in that silence lies the heart of their legacy. Love, once born of duty, endured beyond the reach of crowns. It lingered in the dust of their palace, in the prayers of their chapel, in the stone that carries their likeness still. And though the Tudors who came after would blaze with glory and scandal, none would embody the quiet truth that Henry and Elizabeth had discovered, that the greatest victory a monarch can claim is not conquest, but compassion. In the centuries that followed the death of Henry VII, England moved on, as all nations do. Thrones passed, wars erupted, empires were forged and lost. Yet beneath the marble floor of Westminster Abbey, 2 figures slept, their hands carved in eternal prayer, their faces turned toward the same heaven. The chronicles recorded their reign as prudent, prosperous and stable. But what endured beyond the politics of their time was something quieter, more human, the love that had outlived power. When visitors entered the Lady Chapel, they saw not just the beginning of a dynasty, but the residue of emotion that history could never quite erase. The air there seemed different, touched by the faint echo of what had once been living warmth. Light streamed down through stained glass, glancing across the effigies of the king and queen. Henry in armor, Elizabeth in serenity. The Tudor rose, sculpted above them, seemed to bloom endlessly, its petals carved in red and white stone. Generations would come to interpret it as a symbol of political unity, but the truth whispered beneath that symbolism was more intimate. It was a memorial to a marriage that had transformed necessity into love. By the early 16th century, their legacy had already begun to evolve. Their son, Henry VIII, ascended the throne with the vitality and confidence that his father had once lacked. He inherited Elizabeth's beauty and his father's will, but little of their restraint. Where Henry VII had built his reign upon prudence and balance, the son ruled by appetite and conviction. He would shatter the very church his parents had revered, take 6 wives, and plunge England into a moral and spiritual tempest. Yet even he, in his moments of reflection, could not escape their shadow. Chroniclers noted that in his youth, before arrogance hardened him, Henry VIII often spoke of his mother with reverence. He kept her portrait near his private altar, and, on the anniversaries of her death, ordered masses to be sung in her name. Some believed that his desperate pursuit of sons, his relentless quest for heirs, was driven by the memory of the woman who had died, bringing life into the world. Whether conscious or not, the echo of Elizabeth of York haunted the Tudor line, as if her gentleness lingered like a ghost at the edge of power. Margaret Tudor, the eldest daughter, carried her parents' dream of unity beyond England's borders. Her marriage to James IV of Scotland, arranged during her father's later years, would one day link the two crowns that had so often been at war. From her would descend the Stuart line, which, after a century of turbulence, would reunite the kingdoms under a single monarch. Thus, in a strange and patient way, the peace Henry and Elizabeth had forged continued to unfold, long after their bones had turned to dust. Historians, centuries later, would debate endlessly what kind of love bound the first Tudor king and queen. Was it affection born from shared trauma, a calculated alliance that deepened into tenderness, or simply two souls who, in the ruin of war, recognized in each other the last surviving fragment of innocence? No record can answer such questions. Their letters were few, their private words lost. But what remains, the gestures, the decisions, the grief, speaks louder than declarations. Henry's refusal to remarry, his dedication to Elizabeth's memory, the chapel he built to house them both, all these form a portrait not of politics but of devotion. Their marriage had begun as a strategy to end a civil war. By the time of their deaths, it had become the moral heart of a new England. The Tudor dynasty that followed would expand that power outward, establishing England as a European force. But none of their descendants would ever replicate the quiet equilibrium that Henry and Elizabeth achieved. They ruled not with grandeur, but with gravity, not through fear, but through steadiness. In their union, England found a brief glimpse of what it could become, a nation healed by compassion as much as by law. The myth of their love took root early. In the decades after their passing, poets and chroniclers began to soften the hard edges of fact, shaping the story into a parable, They wrote of the king who won his crown on the battlefield, but lost his heart to peace, and of the queen whose beauty soothed the rage of a divided land. It was said that their souls were bound by divine providence, that heaven itself had chosen them to reconcile the houses of York and Lancaster. The truth, of course, was far less mystical. They were mortals, bound by duty, flawed and fragile as any other. But perhaps that was what made their story endure. As the Reformation swept across England and the abbeys burned, their tombs somehow survived untouched. Even when the altars were stripped and saints' faces defaced, no one dared to desecrate the resting place of the first Tudor monarchs. The work of love and memory carved in stone seemed beyond politics. The masons who had built the Lady Chapel had done more than craft a tomb. They had built a sanctuary for sentiment in an age of upheaval. Visitors in later centuries described the same scene again and again. The light falling softly across the marble hands, the silence pressing against the vaulted ceiling, the faint smell of incense that seemed to linger though the candles had long since gone cold. Some claimed that if one stood there at dawn, the air itself trembled, as if the ghosts of the king and queen still breathed within the stone. What had begun as a political necessity had become legend. The Tudor rose, first a symbol of reconciliation, now adorned coins, manuscripts, and royal emblems. It appeared on church windows, carved into cathedrals, embroidered on royal robes. But behind that emblem lay the same dual truth, red and white, war and peace, conquest and tenderness. The unity of England was not born merely from treaties or victory. It was born from the fragile alliance between a man who had learned to distrust the world and a woman who had learned to forgive it. Their story found new meaning with each age that rediscovered it. In the Elizabethan era, their granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth I, would preside over England's golden age, her reign steeped in both glory and solitude. Historians would later draw quiet parallels between her and her grandmother. Two women named Elizabeth, both symbols of peace after chaos, both isolated by the crown they wore. The granddaughter, though never a mother, ruled over a nation that still lived in the shadow of the first Tudor Union. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to build power upon memory. In the centuries that followed, their story became part of England's mythology, retold by historians, revived by poets, painted by artists who sought to capture the moment when love transcended bloodlines. Some romanticized it beyond recognition, others stripped it back to its barest truth. Yet in every version, one constant remained: the idea that two people, bound by necessity, had discovered something profoundly human in the midst of power, a tenderness that neither politics nor death could extinguish. The historian of later generations, poring over fragments of correspondence and the faint ink of royal accounts, finds glimpses of that intimacy still. The entries that record the gifts Henry gave her, silks, pearls, a book of hours bound in velvet, are not mere ledgers. They are the remnants of affection, preserved in bureaucracy. The expenses for the chapel, the endless notes in his own hand, demanding precision. These are not the acts of a calculating ruler, but of a man who could not bear the thought of imperfection in the memorial of his love. Even now, half a millennium later, the story of Henry and Elizabeth resonates not because of what they ruled, but because of what they endured. Theirs is a reminder that love, in any age, is an act of defiance, a refusal to yield to the cynicism of survival. Against the backdrop of ambition and war, They found something that neither conquest nor diplomacy could produce: quiet devotion. To stand before their tomb is to feel that defiance still. The stone is cool, the air solemn, but beneath it lies the pulse of humanity that no passage of time can still. Visitors leave flowers, red and white roses entwined, a silent offering to two souls who once healed a nation. In the great continuum of history, their names are often overshadowed by the thunder of those who came after. Henry VIII's cruelty, Elizabeth I's brilliance, the Stuart rebellions, the empire's rise and fall. Yet beneath all of that, in the soft undercurrent of England's memory, their story continues to flow. They were the calm before the storm, the quiet heart within the machinery of monarchy. Their love did not blaze across history. It endured, like candlelight in a crypt, steady, unwavering, eternal. Perhaps that is why their effigies seem to breathe even now. The sculptor who shaped them could not have known how they would age, how centuries of dust would settle on their faces, or how the world would change beyond recognition. But he captured something timeless, the curve of her mouth that suggests serenity, the slight incline of his head toward hers, as though in eternal conversation. Between them lies not just death, but the suggestion of communion, a dialogue that never ends. Their legacy, in the end, is not measured in laws or victories, but in the way they taught a kingdom, weary, divided, suspicious, to believe again in gentleness. They proved that peace could be built not through fear, but through empathy, that love could exist even in the cold architecture of power. In that sense, their marriage became more than a union of houses. It became a mirror of what England itself aspired to be. And though history may speak louder of their descendants, of tyrants, poets, reformers, queens, it is their story, quiet and steadfast, that endures as the soul of the Tudor age. Theirs was the love that stitched the wounds of a nation, the love that lingered when the banners were folded and the trumpets silenced. If one were to open the great book of England's history and turn the brittle pages to that final resting place, the ink may have faded, the language grown old. Yet there, between the lines, something still glows, the faint golden warmth of two hearts that refused to be divided by blood, by death, or by time. The candlelight of their love burns still in the crypt of memory, casting shadows that dance across the centuries. And in that flickering light, Henry and Elizabeth remain, king and queen, husband and wife, two souls who found, for a brief and precious span, peace in each other's keeping. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.